Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. As the world of software-driven everything becomes a reality and development cycles speed up, sales teams are taking a new approach to application security, one that enables security teams to scale by empowering developers to integrate security into their development workflows and toolsets, all while giving security teams the visibility and control they need. Snyk helps software-driven businesses develop fast and stay secure with a developer-first solution that seamlessly and proactively finds and fixes vulnerabilities in open source libraries and containers. Learn more and see the solution for yourself at securityweekly.com/Snyk.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. We are looking for high-quality guest suggestions for our Enterprise Security Weekly podcast to fill our upcoming recording schedule. We're committed to educating and providing entertainment for the information security community, and we would love to hear from you about who you would like us to interview on the show. Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and submitting the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Join Qualys for VMDR Live on April 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern for a live demonstration of the game-changing vulnerability management, detection, and response offering, a unified solution that integrates vulnerability management, threat prioritization, and patching in a single app. Register at securityweekly.com/VMDR2020. This is a week where Zoom has been in the news, so I think we would be remiss if we omitted talking about Zoom. But I wanted to approach this less so from the angle of the specific flaws that people have been talking about, and more as a education or a case study in communicating security, both from the side of Zoom themselves, how they talk about and respond to concerns or design level flaws within their app, but also the security community, or at least voices therein that are kind of rattling about the sky is falling because of for example, local installer could be subverted on Zoom, and this equates to a 0-day, which may be correct in terminology, but not necessarily correct in the threat model that really applies to most end users. So
can I start with no root? Oh, sorry.
There we are. So hopefully everyone playing at home on their bingo cards has that one. We're going to move that into the center next time because that'll be the freebie for sure. But yeah, no root. That's a great point. So there's a couple things just about the design of this that Zoom could respond a little bit better about understanding how they are making certain design decisions in implementing Zoom. But here is a tool that is a video conferencing app, doing screen sharing, doing chat. You can even send your friends links, just like you could over email or over a Signal, for that matter, or IM, your favorite IM client, and they could click on that. They could ignore the chat window that pops up, and they could execute whatever malware you've decided to send them, which I'm somewhat snarkily pointing out is a threat model that exists in pretty much any communication tool. So it's just been kind of interesting. So I don't know, John, what you've been seeing and what you've been thinking about as you've seen a lot of the conversations around Zoom.
Yeah, it's been interesting. It's as anytime something like this pops up, especially of this sort of oh my god in the news, friends reach out and they're like, hey, should I be worried about this? I invoice each of them as appropriate, but. I think sort of as you were saying, Mike and Matt, both you guys, where this is coming from for me is not so much the actual issues, but actually what's interesting to me is how Zoom responded to, because I think they did respond pretty quickly. But I actually had a bit of an argument with one friend over the weekend who And it's funny, as I tried to explain more and more how AppSec works and how we respond to these things, she was getting more and more disgruntled about the software industry in general. And she's like, why are you guys always trying to screw us over? It's like, there's very few companies out there that are actively trying to screw over customers, right? So I think that's the first thing that we really need to get out to people is like, we're all humans. We all make mistakes. One of her comments was around, how was she saying? Is like, a developer should understand all the code which goes into their product. And so this is someone who is technical, but she's never been a software developer. So let's put that out there. And I think what's going on is as we go more and more down this path of using these libraries, like we were talking about in the last segment, each of us understands less and less about the software which we're using, right? Do I know the intricacies of OpenSSL or React or Go or Java or JavaScript? Or I mean, we know a lot of stuff about what we're doing, but we still really know it's just an infinitesimal drop in the pan. So I think that's something we need to do a better job of getting out to our friends and having them understand. Is like, look, when we see something, it comes down to, if there's a new vulnerability out there, how quickly do we respond to it? Do we try to make sure we don't do it again in the future? A lot of these are sort of things you've probably heard me say before, but I think it's obviously still something of importance. So then, well, really quick, you were talking about threat modeling on this one, Mike, and I didn't say before off air, but when I read Patrick's blog post last week, as soon as I saw the part which said this is at least two of them are locally exploitable only, I literally closed the tab. I'm like, okay, I don't care about that. It's if you're able to get onto my machine, I've got much larger problems than Zoom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because any application that has full access to the box could do all kinds of malicious stuff. It's not just Zoom here. And to your point, John, look, these applications are really, really complex. I mean, we're talking about an application that is doing video and audio streaming across the internet, connecting people together. These are highly complex pieces of software. There are going to be vulnerabilities, folks. There's no way around it. We were just joking on the last segment about if you want 100% security, wipe the drives, throw it to the bottom of the ocean. That's true, right? So how do you mitigate these types of vulnerabilities when you find them? In this particular case, they had root privileges for the installer that could do some malicious things. They're using an old version of an API that's been deprecated. These are things you should be testing for as part of your code. Try to find them, and when you do find them, you fix them, right? And I think Zoom's CEO said, look, bad on us, right? We did not have a good week, and they're going to take the next 90 days not to build new features, but to go back and look at all this and fix as many of these issues as they can. That was a very open, honest response. It may not do their stock well, but it will do trust to their broader community well in the long run.
Yeah, and that building of the trust and confidence is an important aspect that we've touched on a few times in past episodes as well. And it really, to loop back also to the threat modeling, and you're doing AppSec wrong. You're doing AppSec wrong if you're just saying a flaw exists, don't use this app, because that jokingly put 100% secure app at the bottom of the ocean. Actually, you could argue isn't even 100% secured because you've completely destroyed availability and nobody can use it. And if you just say this week there were RCEs in the news for and critical vulns for both, for all Chrome, Safari, and for Firefox. What is good about Chrome and Safari and Firefox, for that matter, is they have a strong sandboxing design to them, and they have a lot of the teams have built up reputation. They've built up mitigating aspects of why RCEs are still bad, but they can be responded to quickly and addressed quickly. So to your point, Matt, too, the communication from Zoom is also improving a bit. So they'll hopefully start using common terms like end-to-end encryption and stop using them in uncommon ways and use them closer to what end-to-end encryption means in something like Signal, for that matter, rather than just saying you were using TLS. So I think as this is a great conversation to have and refer to if you're going to product teams and saying, people are going to be using your apps regardless of what a security people are saying. So let's make sure that people using the apps are using apps that are secure and they're being well protected, because everybody still wants to browse the web. Everybody still wants to click on a link. There's no such thing as an evil link, which is why just phishing shouldn't be about it still works, and it shouldn't be about don't click on that link, because that's just another example of doing AppSec wrong.
Yeah.
So, a little further on that one. Well, first I have to ask if an application isn't used in the woods, is it secure? But on a more serious note, it comes back to what you're saying. It's really, I think what we're seeing here is a lot of us who who either talk on the show or listen to the show, hopefully, we're used to day in, day out, part of our organizations picking technologies based off security to some degree, right? I know some of the other web conferencing software packages out there have to comply with FDA security standards. So maybe I might think about those instead of this one. If I'm picking an encryption library and blah, blah, you get the idea. But I think what's interesting about this is the general public doesn't usually go down that path, right? They're not usually thinking, I'm going to buy this, phone because of security, or I'm not going to buy this brand new lock for the front door of my house that came from a startup that's 6 months old because it's secure. They're just they're more whiz bang, hey, look, sparkly thing, and that's what gets people into it. I think it's been really interesting over the last month or so how significant the uptake in use has been in Zoom in particular. Why is Zoom, not Skype, not Teams is now getting a little bit of pickup, but all these other things which we've had out there mature for the last decade or more, why didn't they get the attention? What did Zoom have correct in their marketing or their drive or whatever they were doing? And why were people not thinking about security as part of that? And we're not going to get them to, I don't think. All right, I think the closest thing I can think of is you walk through the airport and you're told to tell 10 million times if you see something, say something. Are people going to start doing that with software? I don't think so, unfortunately, but I think that's sort of the interesting aspect of this.
Well, I think the challenge Zoom has is that it's really easy to have somebody join a call that's not a Zoom account, right? All you need is a link to click. Like with Skype, I have to log in for my Skype to work, which I think is part of Microsoft Teams platform because Microsoft owns it, right? If I'm going to use Google Hangouts, I need to be authenticated to my Google account, for example. Zoom, you don't necessarily, you got to download the app, but you don't necessarily you can just click a link and boom, you're in, right? So I think it's the easiness of Zoom that creates this interesting challenge for them over some of the other platforms.
But I think that's a great way to bring in secure defaults, because you can actually do that within Zoom and requiring authenticated users, requiring passwords for that matter. But it's not like that on default. And that's what's really important here. And one of the questions is, if we approach this from a product management perspective, what should the default be? Because we want this to be a viral, if you will, use product to spread through friends, through people, and to be easily adopted. But at what point does that ease of adoption start to introduce too much of a risk? And so we need to step back and say, have that product security discussion now and say, well, this 10-digit number may actually be pretty guessable, especially when we have a huge population of active meetings. So maybe we need to either swap one of those features from off to on so we have better secure defaults, or do something different that makes that brute force guessing a lot more difficult. And I think we'll definitely. I have 3 other articles about flaws that I wanted to also start to shift to, but I think we'll be coming back to a bunch of Zoom topics as we talk to them, because I know, John, I think you had a little bit more to say. But let me dive real quickly here to this our next article about it's a popular digital wallet that exposed a lot of sensitive data, due to, drumroll, or unexciting drumroll, because it was an S3 bucket misconfiguration. So here we have yet another misconfiguration. But what stood out to me is that here was an app that held images. In this case, people were using to store images of their credit cards, including the CVV. So suddenly you have a popular app that's holding really sensitive information And they did not approach this necessarily, setting aside the S3 bucket configuration, they didn't even approach it with a good idea or a mind of an encryption model for it. And I think we could have some similar conversations about those product management and product security trade-offs that we could have had equally so with Zoom.
Yeah, what's interesting about this. So now we've hit the configuration management bucket. We already talked no root, and we'll get to some of the other ones with other articles coming. But this is why I don't use these types of applications on my phone, because I don't trust the service. I would never take a picture of my credit card and store it in one of these app wallets, but a lot of people do. I just think really, really differently because of the space that I'm in. But I mean, this is a simple misconfiguration. Now you have all this credit card and other data. There was all kinds of membership cards that were out there. I mean, it could be your social security card. I mean, there are all kinds of potential things that could have shown up in these images.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's not like there's just as we were talking about Zoom, and it's not like they had secure defaults. They have the ability to require passwords, require authenticated users. In this case, with this wallet, there's a lot of encryption design patterns that they could have followed. Everything from just per user encryption to envelope encryption, so that the S3 bucket is containing just encrypted blobs, and they're being decrypted on the client devices. Because there's I can't imagine good reasons that all of these need to be image scanned and OCR'd and analyzed on the server side for marketing purposes or things like that. So it's not like there are a lack of security design patterns to follow through here. And what we're seeing is the very unfortunate consequence of not encrypting and not paying attention to good defaults for your S3 buckets.
Yeah. Back to the concept of end-to-end encryption, right? I mean, that means on the phone, through the transmission, and even in the S3 bucket.
There was a article, I think it was a blog post. It popped on my radar last week. I'm not sure how much earlier it was out there. And it was sort of fawning over, someone went through and they were trying to pick out what was the best cloud service ever, and they decided it was S3. And now sort of after seeing this and thinking about it, I'm like, okay, I get it. Yeah, it's infinitely scalable. It's got all these really great things about it. But man, how many of these massive dumps have we seen? We didn't even talk about Marriott a few weeks ago. I don't think that was S3, but there's so many of these. It's like, and I know they've got the defaults are better now than what they used to be, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm unimpressed.
Yeah. Agreed. And I think so. Switching to another article, I pulled out a article about mobile security because, we had a great conversation with Grant in the previous segment about IAST, which we haven't really talked that much about that particular tool. So it was great to hear from Grant and his perspective how to use it. And here I wanted to focus on secrets, not in S3 or AWS for that matter, but secrets that are compiled into these apps. So here are some researchers who did an academic study, went through, 6,800 Play Store apps, 1,000 third-party apps, and basically 12,000 roughly Android apps. And they basically identified a couple categories of secrets that were compiled into the tool that could be used, or into the Android app that could be used for various purposes. And they are basically to access the app to do a sort of backdoor method, not necessarily malicious, but to be able to do, change the behavior of the app. Or they have master passwords, or they have other secret access keys to APIs that are being used, or basically secret commands that have basically, think of those as sort of Easter eggs, if you will, within the app. And it was just really interesting to see that the idea of compiling in your secrets into the client, which can't really be trusted and which can much more easily be reverse engineered, to see that so prevalent was pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, we don't only see this in mobile apps. We see this in IoT devices as well, right? These are common mistakes that we see in a lot of these more consumer-based devices. but have huge implications. I mean, even in the IoT space with some of these defaults, because now these things are communicated on your internal Wi-Fi routers, et cetera, that give you access to all the other traffic on your network. I mean, these are just really, really bad design principles, which is why mobile security testing tools are so important to make sure, some of the stuff isn't embedded in these applications.
I guess.
Yeah.
My question on it, or my thought process is, how do we educate the end user? Right? Because you got so many Android folks out there. Like, I know a lot of tech people like the Android. Okay, cool. You know what you're doing. But there's so many end users who are like, oh, I'm not going near Apple. They're bad. Steve Jobs, bad person. But there has to be some sort of way that you can, I don't want to say market, but publish this in a way that gets a lot of attention, that people actually start thinking about what they should be doing. Google Project Zero loves to, go and rip on everyone else. But how about, do we get a little bit more attention on these Android apps, which are quite honestly absolute crap?
And John, here's the scary part. Almost 4,800 of the apps tested are pre-installed on these devices. The user doesn't even have a choice. They show up by default.
Yeah, and these are definitely harder because, and it's great to point out what could Project Zero do to help with this, or what could the Play Store tooling help to do to identify this, because it's a lot within the sandbox framework of, we can say, within Android or Apple for that matter. These secrets within the client, they're just, they're within the client, the application itself, talking probably to the application's backend web-based API. So it's not like they need special permissions. So some things you could do are provide key stores, or so that these apps can better securely store secrets if they need to manage secrets. So that would be one thing that these tools can do. But Android and iOS do provide these, for better or for worse, depending on what version of Android you're on. But yeah, I think other than that, I'm kind of racking my head for what else we could do to get these apps, address it as a class of problem rather than a one-off problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think part of what's going on there, right, is so many of these apps are just being, the current business model is, if you're able to put some sort of app out there, get a fraction of a percentage of usage, and then throw some ads into it, you're able to make some money off of it. Or gather information, and that's really their focus, not so much thinking about
right,
any form of security. But anyways, keep going.
Well, speaking of security and Microsoft dealing with a class of bugs within their win32k component, which is essentially their the UI code that used to live in user space. Then for performance reasons, this was in the ancient history of the Windows when it was 2-digit versions, but then moved into kernel for largely performance reasons. But then once this UI code was within the kernel, it was a great privileged escalation vector for attackers. What was really interesting this week is that a researcher identified roughly, I think, up to 24 bugs within Win32k, and essentially identified a new class, a new way to exploit this UI code, or this UI library within Microsoft. And it was really, they called it the smash the ref, as in smashing the reference, to essentially get a use after free type of bug. So again, I can't even remember what the CWE entry is for UAF. So please, listeners, write in, or we'll add that to the bingo card for next time. But it's not like use after free is very new, 20, 30-year-old, if not more, bug, but a new way of exploiting it. So I highlighted this article because it was a cool amount of research. The researcher, I think, if I didn't put it in the show notes, it has a link to their GitHub repo where they talk through about 9 or 10 different flaws with demonstration code for this. And it was just really interesting to see the success of saying, okay, here is an attack surface, Win32k, people have been looking at this for decades now, literally. Probably has been picked over, but hey, look, lo and behold, there's still something new there, and that is bounty worthy. So also earn some coin off of this. And it's not like software ever reaches 100% secure. And here's just another example of that.
What's interesting about this class of bugs is the communication between the kernel and the user space, and the ability for user space to exploit kernel level calls. Again, it's this whole issue of root privileges and how they're handled back and forth. And it's issues like this when you take something that needs user access, you throw it into the kernel because you want to improve performance, but the channel between the two creates this really interesting attack vector that just keeps on giving, actually.
So and it's also... Go ahead.
Sorry. I think a good portion of this attack vector is going to go away, or this particular class of issues. With the new versions of Windows, I think it was rolled out last year, but they're just starting to have hardware for it, the secured core. There's actually the whole most of the operating system is running in a Ring 2 or Ring 3, and then they've got a separate security process running in Ring 0 that's in its own hypervisor that watches the rest of the OS and watches for bad children like this. So I think that's, at least from the device driver side, is going to cut down a lot of this type of stuff.
Yeah, and I think as we see, I think Apple's doing something similar with Mac OS, where you're starting to kind of basically containerize the operating system to the point where you start to create real isolation, real barriers that don't allow some of these cross attacks to happen. Will actually benefit the operating systems longer term.
Yeah.
Yes,
and for those, briefly, sorry, I keep interrupting you today. For those who are interested on the coding side of this, the GitHub repo, the code is really nicely documented to sort of walk through what they're doing and how they're doing it. So if you want to practice or get some experience in this stuff, it's C++. That's not necessarily a plus, no pun intended, but the code itself is pretty well documented.
C++, one of the best languages out there. Sorry, John. And there was, and this was also the other reason to highlight this too. It also demonstrates a change in communications. Just look at how both Microsoft has responded to this. They're diving in already, speaking with the researcher to address the class of bugs that's here, much like you were just saying, John, as well as they're changing before this release as well. They've been working on changing their architecture and getting away from these kernel modules or kernel extensions on the Mac OS side of things, because all these kernel extensions are very powerful. It's a great way to get performance, as a callback to our discussion with Grant, but they're also a great way to, and I'll acknowledge this with the C++ idiom, to shoot yourself in the foot, because you're basically giving up root every time you're allowing the user space to dive into the kernel. So just different ways of thinking about and threat modeling, how could we try to fix this class of problems? And I'm going to use that to segue into some more communication, some more work coming out of Microsoft using MITRE's attack framework. It was pretty interesting to see them apply this to Kubernetes. And I'm highlighting this article both for anyone who's running Kubernetes, to basically say it's a great way to address a maturity of your configuration or your deployment. Go through these additional, or these categories, from initial access all the way to discovery, lateral movement, and impact. Look at how Microsoft has enumerated different ways Kubernetes could be exploited, could be attacked threatened by an attacker, or compromised by an attacker, trying to get my language right here. And do you have countermeasures for that? Do you have logging, monitoring, some other mitigating control in place to at least prevent, or hopefully to at least detect, this type of attack? And this is just a great way to walk through this with Kubernetes. But ideally, you could apply this to other applications you have, or even potentially at your organization level as well.
No root, configuration, and protect the APIs. Sorry.
I need to get that on a t-shirt for you. But in seriousness, I this blog post I think will help a lot of people. It's really just from a high level, Kubernetes is this big, crazy, complex thing, right? And they've done a pretty good job of just sort of enumerating through a lot of places. Just stop and think about, what is that? Do you know what a cluster binding is? But then if you do, what does that actually get you?
Yeah, there's absolutely a lot to learn here, and if you also notice, that's why I was letting John and Matt talk more on this topic, because Kubernetes is still Greek to me. So
we see a lot of interest in Kubernetes. In to John's point, it's pretty complex. There's a lot of components to it, but this really does break down some really interesting areas that you have to focus on Kubernetes. But it just shows you've created a sub-MITRE ATT&CK framework just for Kubernetes. I mean, that just shows you the level of complexity it takes for something like a Kubernetes orchestration platform to run. There are a lot of different attack vectors here. So I think, to John's point, this will help a lot of people do a better job of securing their Kubernetes clusters. But yes, there's a lot of components to deal with when you roll out Kubernetes.
Yeah, absolutely complex. And that's what makes it a lot tough. And that's absolutely why the security has to be collaborating with and a part of that DevOps management and maintenance of that Kubernetes environment, because you can't just say, we're going to come in every month or every quarter with a pen test or with an audit checklist and just make sure everything's going well. Designed it in from the beginning, because it is so complex, like you were pointing out. And that also then kind of tacking on this at the end, but we've been really focusing on flaws and bugs and product design. And I want to make sure we didn't forget the end-to-end life cycle of your secure development life cycle, or your software development life cycle, depending on what angle you're taking. I'm talking SDL from Microsoft, but logging here. So there's this article from Dark Reading that I thought was pretty good. It talks at a high level about logging, but near the end of the article, it has some pretty good questions and really good focus on making sure that your logs are actually contributing to security. And they're questions of like, what are the most common attack vectors against your product? Well, guess what? If you look at that Microsoft article from MITRE ATT&CK, that's a great way to start talking about what are those attack vectors. Now, do we actually have logs that would indicate activity along one of those vectors? Can you parse them? Can you normalize these logs so that you could actually, for example, drop them into GCP BigQuery and then have these logs that come out from these particular tools correlated with these logs from OS Query, with these logs from your WAF, with these other logs from some other tool, and you can find out what is this particular IP address activity looking like across our organization. So again, just a really good way, I think, of having some questions to really press on, rather than just say log everything. Sure, log everything, but you have to be smart about what you're using those logs for. And are you actually collecting the logs in a way that they are helping your security team?
Yeah, we actually did a really interesting webinar with Gravwell on this topic of cloud and hybrid and how to pull the logs together. Because without the logs, there's nothing to analyze. And collecting logs in the cloud get a little challenging sometimes. You sometimes have to correlate those with on-premise logs. The webcast walks through some of the different ways you can collect and analyze logs, both in the cloud and in on-prem environments. If somebody wants to understand some of the different ways to do it, that's a really good webcast to reference, specifically around logging in the cloud.
And that is securityweekly.com/webcasts, as I remember from reading all the announcements.
Yes.
So we've run through quite a bit of flaws, quite a bit of things. Any final parting thoughts, either on Zoom or one of the articles that we chatted about today?
We're just going to see more of this over the next few weeks, I think. We're in an interesting time, interesting environment. I expect more of these types of flaws to continue to come out over the next few weeks. So I think we'll have plenty to talk about on future shows.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the folks that do the digging and tracking down these type of vulnerabilities, we're used to working at home, right? This is old hat to us. We're not going to watch the webinar about how to work from home. I'm not doing this right now, but those folks are out there actively poking and prodding and seeing what they can do. So they're bored and they've got time and they're not supposed to go outside. So you'll see more.
Yes.
Absolutely, yes. So when as you have that free time, take an hour or so out of your day, listen to Application Security Weekly, then take another couple hours to poke at through some old attack surface, whether it's on Windows, Android, Mac OS, iOS. Go report some bugs to your bug bounty platform of choice, and then let us know what you've been enjoying. We'd love to hear more listener feedback about our segments, about our interviews, and about the topics we're covering. And want to thank you all for listening. As always, want to thank Matt and John for joining me here, and we are going to see you next week on Application Security Weekly.